Since 1722, Louisiana has executed 658 people. There have been several different methods, from hanging, the electric chair, and now lethal injection. This is the story of Toni Jo Henry, the only woman to ever be executed in Louisiana's electric chair. But first, go to patreon.com/LouisianaDread for exclusive content and stories like this. Toni Jo Henry was born January 3rd, 1916 in Shreveport. Her mother died of tuberculosis when she was a child, and she was forced to live with her father and stepmother. Now, back then, keep in mind, having tuberculosis or even being related to somebody who had it was a societal stigma. When she was 13 years old, she was fired from her part-time job at a macaroni factory. I can't make that up, because her manager found out that her mother died from TB. Upon hearing this news, her father beat the hell out of her and she ran away from home. Unfortunately, this led her to becoming a prostitute at a very young age and began working at a brothel in Shreveport's red light district. Her real name was Annie McQuinston, but would then change her name to Toni Jo Hood. Eventually, Toni became addicted to cocaine and moved her operations along the southwestern Louisiana and Texas border. One of her clients went by the name of Claude Henry, and they soon became a couple in 1939. Claude was a prize fighter in Austin, Texas, and went by the nickname of Cowboy. They got married, and very shortly after the honeymoon, Claude Cowboy Henry was arrested for the murder of a police officer that happened before the marriage. In 1940, only 2 months after marrying Toni, Claude was sentenced to 50 years in the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville. Now, I don't speak for every man, but most of us want a ride or die partner to settle down with, and that's exactly the type of person Toni Jo Henry was. After Claude was sentenced, Toni Jo began planning to break him out of prison. Now, she would recruit an accomplice by the name of Harold Burks, who was an Army deserter and ex-felon himself. Harold claimed to know the layout of the prison, and the two made a plan to rob a bank in the hopes of securing money to help their cause. The two recruited a pair of teenagers to rob a gun store and delivered them ammo to go along with it, and their plan seemed set. In an act of unfortunate timing, a man named Joseph P. Calloway was driving his Ford Coupe to a friend's house when he saw a man and woman hitchhiking on the side of the road. Now, you could probably guess what happened next. Being a kind human being, Calloway pulled over and let Toni Jo and Harold Burks into his car. As they were driving past Jennings, Louisiana, the two robbed Calloway at gunpoint, then locked him in the trunk of his own car. The plan was to use the vehicle as a getaway car, but Toni had an idea. They pulled the car down a secluded dirt road, and she ordered Calloway out of the trunk. He was then told to strip naked because Toni wanted to give his clothes to her locked-up hubby after he was released from prison. Well, free from prison. Joseph Calloway was then shot in the back of the head with a .32 caliber revolver and died instantly. The two then drove the stolen car to Camden, Arkansas, where they intended to rob the bank. Toni Jo fell asleep that night while Harold stayed awake thinking, and it was about that time he became a bit concerned about how far Toni was willing to go to break her man out of jail. Had a solution? Harold abandoned her and took the car. Now, Toni was alone and on the run after committing murder. She returned to her home in Shreveport by bus and went to her aunt for refuge. After learning that her niece killed the guy at gunpoint, her aunt contacted a Louisiana state trooper and Toni was arrested. She confessed to the murder and disclosed the location of the body, and her first trial was held right behind me at the Calcasieu Parish Courthouse at the end of March 1940. Because the general public thought Toni Jo was very attractive and that this case had the possibility of a death penalty, the trial gained plenty of media coverage. She claimed, again after already admitting to it, that it was actually Harold who delivered the fatal shot. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and convicted her. She was then sentenced to hang until dead. Toni Jo appealed and was granted a new trial on the basis that intense media coverage surrounding the trial had an impact on the actual outcome. The second trial began a year later in February of 1941, but this time Harold took the stand and testified against Toni Jo. Again, she was found guilty by the jury, and again she appealed, and again she was granted a new trial. Now, that's a privilege many people don't receive. But Harold would also receive the death penalty after Toni Jo told authorities that he was her accomplice, even though he didn't really kill anybody. The third trial was held in January of 1943, in which she was sentenced to death for a third and final time. She did try in vain to appeal this verdict, and she even made an appeal to then-Governor Sam Jones for clemency, which was also denied. During the time Toni Jo was being tried, Louisiana changed its method of execution from hanging to electrocution. Louisiana's electric chair didn't have a permanent home at first and was taken from parish to parish to perform the executions. The deed was usually done in the courthouse or the jail of the parish where the condemned inmate had been convicted. Texas had nicknamed their electric chair Old Sparky, while Louisiana had the more ominous nickname of Gruesome Gertie. In a bit of a criminally romantic twist, Toni Jo's husband, Claude Cowboy Henry, escaped from prison 4 days before she was set for execution. He wanted to see his lovely wife and break her out of prison as she intended to do for him, but he was recaptured in Beaumont, Texas. On November 28, 1942, Toni Jo would be brought to the basement of this building behind me, the Calcasieu Parish Courthouse, and became the first woman and sixth person overall to ever be killed by Gruesome Gertie. Shortly afterwards, Claude Henry was released from prison on parole, but was shot to death in Dallas on July 15, 1945. It seems, though, like Toni Jo is still around the Calcasieu Parish Courthouse. She's been known to meddle with office equipment and lock doors, but the most eerie encounter is at the location where she died. It's been reported several times that sometimes you can still smell her burning skin around where she was electrocuted. Toni Jo Henry lives in pop culture still, with books inspired by her life, such as the fictionalized A Savage Wisdom, and a film focusing on this story came out in 2013 called The Pardon. She's buried at Orange Grove Cemetery in Lake Charles. Now, although her life seemed to be tormented with bad circumstances, she will remain a solid piece of Louisiana history forever. Now, we couldn't bring you this information without your support on Patreon, and we'd like to thank all of those who have already contributed and encourage anyone watching this video right now to consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/LouisianaDread. For more Louisiana history, horror, folklore, and culture, be sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel. I'm Kyle Crosby, and this is Louisiana Dread Quick History.